Hello everyone, welcome back once again to my educational channel on biology. I'm teacher Janet. Today we'll be discussing mechanisms of breathing, subtopic 8.2. So we're going to discuss the breathing mechanism, meaning the inhalation and exhalation process of four organisms: humans, insect, frog, and fish. Let's begin. The learning standards for this lesson are as follows. Mechanisms of breathing, subtopic 8.2. After this lesson, we should be able to compare and contrast the breathing mechanisms in humans and animals. That is, in insects, frog, fish, and humans. (8.2) Mechanisms of breathing. Humans and animals have different breathing mechanisms. Now, breathing is defined as the inhalation and exhalation processes which occur repeatedly and it involves the environment and the respiratory system of an organism. So we'll discuss the breathing mechanisms of four organisms: humans, insect, frog, and fish. For humans, insect, and frog, we'll discuss how air is inhaled and exhaled from the respiratory system, right? And for fish, we'll discuss how water is inhaled and exhaled from the fish's respiratory system. So in this lesson, we're going to discuss the breathing mechanisms in humans and animals and then make a comparison, okay? And find out the similarities and the differences. So let's just get into it straight away. Now, what are the similarities between the breathing mechanisms in humans and animals? Firstly, humans and animals, such as the insect, frog, and fish, have special muscular structures to expand and contract the respiratory cavity. Okay, so for example, in humans, we have this muscular structure called the diaphragm. All right, and we also have the ribcage, which contains the intercostal muscles, right? Now, all these are used to expand and contract the respiratory cavity, which is the thoracic cavity here, right? So these pink structures are the lungs. Now, you have studied about the breathing mechanism in humans in Form 3. So try and recall from there, okay? Then the breathing mechanism involves changes in the volume and pressure in the respiratory cavity that are caused by these muscular structures. So the muscular structure, like the diaphragm, all right, it can move upwards or downwards, and it will change the volume of this thoracic cavity, and thus it will change the pressure in this thoracic cavity. Then it will cause inhalation and exhalation to occur. So for inhalation, the volume of this thoracic cavity here will be increased like this one, like this. Okay, when the diaphragm moves downwards, then the air pressure will decrease so that air can enter the body from the atmosphere, which has higher pressure. Okay, now for exhalation, the volume is decreased. For example, the diaphragm will move upwards to form a dome shape, and this decreases the volume in the thoracic cavity so that the air pressure inside will increase, so that the higher air pressure inside the thoracic cavity will force the air out of the, like this, force the air out of the thoracic cavity into the atmosphere. So let's find out more. Now, let's understand two basic rules for the breathing mechanisms before we discuss the breathing mechanisms of different organisms. So different organisms apply the same rules or principles for their breathing mechanisms. Organisms such as humans, fishes, frogs, and insects. So the first rule is the one that you have studied in physics, which is Boyle's law, which states that P is proportional to 1 over V. P is the pressure and V is the volume. All right. So when P is proportional to 1 over V, it means that the pressure P is inversely proportional to volume V. That means that if the volume of a cavity, such as the respiratory cavity, okay, increases. So example of respiratory cavity is the thoracic cavity in the chest region of humans, which is used to carry out the breathing mechanism. So in this cavity, there are a pair of lungs, right? So if the volume of this thoracic cavity increases, the pressure of air in the cavity will decrease. So when V increases, P decreases. Now, the reason for this is that because there's more space inside the thoracic cavity now when the volume increases, for the air particles to move. And so there'll be less collisions between the air particles and the wall of the cavity. Okay, so this will cause the air pressure to decrease. So thus, higher atmospheric pressure outside forces air into the cavity, right? When the volume of the respiratory cavity or thoracic cavity increases and the air pressure decreases, right? There will be higher atmospheric pressure. Pressure outside will be higher than inside the thoracic cavity. So the higher air pressure outside forces the air into the body and air enters the body. Okay? So exhalation is just the opposite. Volume of thoracic cavity will decrease so that the air pressure increases and air exits the body. We'll come to that in a short while. So the second rule is that air or water moves from a region of higher pressure to a region of lower pressure. It always moves. The air or the water always moves from a region of higher pressure to a region of low pressure. Okay? So for fishes, it's the water that moves, right? But for land organisms, it's the air that moves from region of higher pressure to region of lower pressure. So in the mechanism of breathing of organisms, the steps to the breathing, to inhalation and exhalation, is always like this. The volume of the respiratory cavity, such as the thoracic cavity, is increased or decreased to change the air or water pressure inside the cavity, so that the pressure in the body cavity is either higher or lower than the pressure outside the organism. All right? Then the air pressure in the atmosphere, so that the air or water will move either into or out of the respiratory system. And that is the process of inhalation and exhalation. All right, now, so here again, it shows you the basic rule for breathing mechanism. All right, the air or water always moves from region of high pressure to region of low pressure. So in inhalation, the volume of the body cavity must increase so that the air or water pressure inside the body cavity, inside the respiratory cavity, decreases. And then higher pressure outside will push the air or water into the organism. For example, let's say this is the body of an organism and this is the respiratory cavity, all right, in which are found the respiratory structures such as the alveoli. So to inhale, right, now the body cavity, the volume of the body cavity here has to increase like this, all right, and then what happens to the air pressure here? It will decrease. And as the air pressure decreases to be less than that outside, so this will cause air to be pushed from region of higher pressure to region of lower pressure inside the body cavity, and air will be inhaled. Okay, air will be inhaled. So this is the air. The air has gone in. How about exhalation? Now exhalation is just the opposite. All right, so you have this body cavity here, and the organism will reduce the volume of this body cavity to a smaller volume, so that the air pressure or water pressure inside the body increases to be more than that of the air or water pressure outside. Okay. So the higher pressure inside the respiratory cavity here pushes the air or water out of the organism, and that's exhalation. Okay, so the air has been pushed out. Right, so this same principle is used for all the organisms that we're going to discuss, okay, for the breathing mechanism. So first of all, let's discuss the breathing mechanism of humans. Now, for every organism, we're going to discuss what the respiratory aperture is, the opening, the respiratory opening is, what are the structures that help in the breathing process, and the breathing mechanism. So for humans, the respiratory aperture means the opening, are the nostrils. So nostrils are the openings that are of the nasal cavity here. Okay, they are the openings of the nasal cavity. They allow air to go in, to be inhaled or exhaled. Now, structures that help in breathing there are three structures, all right? The ribcage, which is a bony structure here that consists of 12 ribs, right? And then intercostal muscles found in between the ribs, and these intercostal muscles can contract or relax to move the ribcage upwards and outwards or inwards and downwards. Then we have the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is another muscular structure that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity below. Okay. Now the breathing, so think of the word RID, rib cage. Rib is RIB, but this think of the word rib to remember the three structures involved in breathing: rib cage, intercostal muscles, diaphragm. Right? Now, breathing mechanism. Our breathing mechanism is assisted by the contraction and relaxation of these intercostal muscles in between the ribs and of the diaphragm muscles below here in the diaphragm. So the movement of the rib cage upwards and outwards or downwards and inwards is used in the breathing mechanism, and also the movement of the diaphragm, okay, upwards or downwards, also helps in the breathing mechanism. Let's find out more. Let's look at some parts of the human body that are involved in the breathing mechanism. The first structure is the rib cage. Alright, so in this front view of the human body, we can see the lung shown here. Okay, but actually the lungs are covered by a structure called the rib cage, which helps to protect the lungs, and the rib cage is also involved in the breathing mechanism of inhalation and exhalation. So the rib cage consists of the ribs, which are the horizontal bones here, and the ribs are joined at the front part, at the sternum here. Then they curve round to the back and they are joined to the vertebral column at the back. The vertebral column is the backbone. Okay, so here we see 2 ribs, but actually there are altogether 12 ribs on each side of the body, which forms the rib cage. So how does the rib cage move up and down? It does so with the help of the intercostal muscles. So there are 2 types of intercostal muscles that are found between the ribs, right? The external intercostal muscles in red here are found on the external surface of the rib cage, and below it is the internal intercostal muscles, which are the blue structures here. Okay, so actually the external intercostal muscles also extend right to the end, but I've cut away this part to show you the internal intercostal muscles. Now, in the side view of the body, here are the external intercostal muscles, the red structures, and below it is the internal intercostal muscles, the blue structures. Then the yellow circles here represent the cross section through the ribs, right? So altogether there are 12 ribs on each side, but I only show 2 here, all right, in the side view. So if you're asked what's the function of the intercostal muscles, we can say that the intercostal muscles, that is the external and internal intercostal muscles, can contract and relax to cause the rib cage to move upwards and outwards, okay, or inwards and downwards. In this way, the volume of the thoracic cavity is changed, and the air pressure inside will also be changed so that either exhalation or inhalation occurs, right? Now, there's another muscular structure called the diaphragm. So what is the diaphragm? It is a dome-shaped muscular structure that separates the thoracic cavity above from the abdominal cavity below. So what is its function? It is the main muscle that's used in breathing, right? It can contract or relax. So when it contracts, it will move downwards. It becomes flat and horizontal. When it relaxes, it will arch upwards, it will curve upwards to form a dome shape, right? So in this way, by moving up or down, it can also change the volume of the thoracic cavity here, so that the air pressure is changed, and this will also aid in the breathing mechanism, all right? So let's see how the 2 structures are used in the breathing mechanism in more detail. Now let's discuss the inhalation and exhalation processes in humans in more detail. So in inhalation, the aim is to increase the volume of the thoracic cavity so that the air pressure of the thoracic cavity decreases, and then higher atmospheric pressure will force the air from the outside into the lungs, right? So how to increase the volume of the thoracic cavity? Firstly, external intercostal muscles contract and internal intercostal muscles relax. So here we see the blue section, the red strips here, they represent the external intercostal muscles. So external intercostal muscles contract. At the same time, internal intercostal muscles must relax, because these two sets of muscles are called antagonistic muscles. They work in opposite ways to one another. When one contracts, the other will relax. Okay, you'll study about that later. So external intercostal muscles contract, but internal intercostal muscles relax. Now, when the external intercostal muscles contract, the ribcage will move upwards and outwards, right? So try and inhale some air now. Can you feel the ribcage, your ribcage moving upwards? Okay, so we have our own model for the ribcage. And as you inhale air, you can also feel below the ribs there, the diaphragm, you can feel the movement of the diaphragm downwards in your body, right? So this is because diaphragm muscles contract so that the diaphragm moves downwards. Okay, the diaphragm muscles contract, they will pull at the sides here, and so the whole diaphragm will move downwards and become flat. So this will also increase the volume of the thoracic cavity, right? So both mechanisms cause the volume of the thoracic cavity to increase. That is the action of the ribcage and the diaphragm. But the pressure of the thoracic cavity, or air pressure in the thoracic cavity, decreases. Thus, the higher atmospheric pressure outside will force the air into the lungs. Okay? So if you're not sure what goes on in inhalation process, just try it out yourself using your own model, your own lungs, ribcage, and diaphragm. Okay? Now, for the side view, we can see here the two sets of muscles, external intercostal muscles represented by the red color strips, and then the internal intercostal muscles are inside. They are represented by the blue structures here. Okay, so external intercostal muscles contract, the ribcage move upwards and outwards. Diaphragm contracts and moves downwards. Or diaphragm muscles contract and move downwards, and make the diaphragm move downwards to become flat and horizontal. This increases the volume of the thoracic cavity, but the air pressure in the thoracic cavity decreases and becomes less than the atmospheric pressure outside. Thus, higher atmospheric pressure outside forces the air into the lungs, and that's inhalation. Okay, the process is called inhalation. Now, for the exhalation process, the reverse occurs. It's the reverse of inhalation. The internal intercostal muscles will contract, whereas the external intercostal muscles relax. So internal intercostal muscles are the blue sections here, and the external intercostal muscles are the red ones, which I've removed to show the internal intercostal muscles underneath, right? So the rib cage will then move downwards and inwards. Then the diaphragm muscles relax. When diaphragm muscles relax, the diaphragm will curve upwards to form its original shape, which is a dome shape. So these two movements, which is the movement of the rib cage and the diaphragm, will reduce the volume of the thoracic cavity here. So when volume of thoracic cavity decreases, the air pressure in the thoracic cavity will increase and will be higher than the atmospheric air pressure, right? So higher internal pressure in the thoracic cavity will then push the air out of the lungs into the atmosphere. Now this is the side view. You can see that the internal intercostal muscles, represented by the blue parts here, contract, and this will cause the rib cage to move inwards and downwards. Okay, so the effect of the internal intercostal muscles is just the opposite of that of the external intercostal muscles. They have opposite effects on the rib cage. Now, diaphragm muscles relax here, so the diaphragm will curve upwards to form its original shape. So these two movements will decrease the volume of the thoracic cavity, but the pressure in this cavity here increases, and so it will push the air out of the lungs into the atmosphere. So in conclusion, in the mechanism of breathing in humans, we can say that during inhalation, the volume of the thoracic cavity is increased, as shown by the red arrows here. And especially in this picture, we see the diaphragm contracting. The diaphragm muscles contract so that the diaphragm is pulled downwards and flattened, right? So this increases the volume of the thoracic cavity so that the air pressure inside this thoracic cavity decreases. Then air will enter the lungs from the atmosphere outside. All right, as the atmospheric pressure is higher, will then be higher than the pressure in the thoracic cavity. On the other hand, for exhalation, the volume of the thoracic cavity is decreased, as shown by the blue arrows here, when the ribcage moves downwards and inwards, and the diaphragm muscles relax so that the diaphragm curves upwards. So this reduces the volume of the thoracic cavity so that the air pressure inside increases and is higher than the air pressure in the atmosphere. Thus, air is pushed or forced out of the lungs in exhalation. Now, just a correction to be made here about this animation. It's a good animation. However, the particles of air here should move into the lungs and not move outside the lungs here. All right, as we can see, sometimes the white particles here move outside. Okay, so it should stay within the lungs. When the air is inhaled, the air will move into the lungs. They don't go out of the lungs to the lower parts of the body. So here are the short notes for inhalation and exhalation, the breathing mechanism in humans. And you can copy this down because it will help you to straight away understand and memorize what happens to the external intercostal muscles, internal intercostal muscles, ribcage, and so forth. All right. So for inhalation, the breathing mechanism is just the opposite compared to exhalation. All right. So since this has been discussed, you can copy it down to reinforce what you have studied. Now, the second organism we're going to discuss are the insects. What is the respiratory aperture or opening in insects? These are the spiracles. So spiracles are found in the lower part of the thorax and the abdominal region. There are many spiracles to allow air to be drawn into the trachea or to allow air to be expelled from the trachea. Okay, so structures that help in breathing are the thorax and the abdomen, specifically the muscles in the thorax and abdomen, right? So the breathing mechanism is assisted by the contraction and relaxation of abdominal muscles here, okay, and to a small extent, probably the thoracic muscles here, okay. So we just remember breathing mechanism is assisted by the abdominal muscles. So insects don't have a nose that allows air to be drawn into the tracheal system. They use their spiracles. Okay, so here is a picture of the tracheal system that we have already discussed in the previous videos. All right, in one of the videos. All right, so you see the spiracle here is leads to the trachea, and then the air will be drawn into the trachea, and then it will move to the tracheals, and then after that oxygen will diffuse from the tracheals into the cells. So let's find out how the insect carries out the inhalation process and exhalation process. In inhalation, first of all, abdominal muscles in the region here of the insect, all right, the lower part here, will relax. Now, when abdominal muscles relax, they don't press so much on the trachea, on the air tubes or the trachea inside the body. They don't press so much on any body cavities or on the trachea, on the tracheae. So this will cause the volume of the trachea and the body cavity to increase. but then the air pressure in the trachea will decrease, okay, because air pressure is inversely proportional to volume. Thus, the air pressure in the trachea will decrease and be lower than the air pressure in the atmosphere, than the atmospheric air pressure. Thus, air will be pushed from region of higher air pressure outside through the trachea, into the trachea through the spiracles. Okay. Now, just as a comparison, okay, let's look at exhalation first of all, right? Now, in exhalation, the opposite occurs. The abdominal muscles contract instead. Now, when abdominal muscles contract, they will move inwards and they will squeeze the trachea more. Okay, so the volume of the trachea and the body cavity will decrease, but the air pressure in the trachea will increase. So it will be, the air pressure in the trachea will be more than the air pressure in the atmosphere, and air will be forced out of the spiracles, forced out of the trachea through the spiracles. Air will be forced out of the trachea through the spiracles, like this. Now, as a comparison, we can use our abdominal muscles also to see the effect on our body, although we do not use abdominal muscles in the breathing mechanism. So, for example, if you were to contract your abdominal muscles, which are just below your ribcage, right? Contract, that means you pull in your stomach, for example. They say pull in the stomach, right? Now, when you contract your abdominal muscles, you can feel that the organs inside are being pressed down, right? The organs like the small intestine and maybe the stomach are pressed down, are pressed inwards. So this is what happens when this is something like what happens when the insect contracts its abdominal muscles, all right? It will press on the trachea, the air tubes here, and it will cause the volume of the trachea to decrease. The trachea will be squeezed, right? So that the volume decreases and the air pressure increases, and then air is forced out of the trachea through the spiracles. So for insects, they don't have a nose to breathe, but they just use the abdominal muscles to inhale and exhale the air. So here are the notes for the breathing mechanism of insects. Abdominal muscles relax and contract to enable air to go in and out of the trachea. When inhaling air, abdominal muscles relax, and this reduces the air pressure in the trachea, so air can enter the trachea through the spiracles. On the other hand, when exhaling air, abdominal muscles will contract, and this increases the air pressure in the trachea, so that air is forced out of the spiracles. Right. The third organism that we are going to discuss is the frog. So the frog's respiratory aperture or opening are the nostrils. Just like humans have nostrils. So the frog has the opening, just like the nose opening, is called the nostril. And the structures that help in breathing are the muscular bucopharyngeal wall, or muscular bucopharyngeal wall of the floor here, the floor, which is a muscular structure. Now, what is the bucopharyngeal cavity? Buco means the mouth, and pharyngeal stands for the pharynx, right? So the bucopharyngeal cavity is the mouth cavity here. The first part is the mouth cavity, and behind it is the pharyngeal, the pharynx, all right? So these two makes up the bucopharyngeal cavity. And then we have the glottis here, which is the opening to the lungs at the back of the mouth, okay? So the glottis is just behind the mouth here. So it can open or close. The glottis can open or close, and the lungs, they are elastic and have folds to increase the total surface area, as we have discussed in the previous video. Right, coming back to this table, so the structures that help in the breathing mechanism are the muscular bucopharyngeal wall, or the floor, okay, the muscular floor of the bucopharyngeal cavity. So the breathing mechanism is assisted by movements of the bucopharyngeal cavity floor. So this bucopharyngeal cavity floor can be lowered or raised, okay? Then The elasticity of the lungs also help because the lungs can expand and contract. Okay, so take note the frog doesn't use a rib cage or a diaphragm to help in breathing. It just uses the mouth, which is unlike humans. We don't use our mouth cavity to breathe, all right? But the frog uses this mouth cavity, so its cavity is quite big. As you can see here, the mouth is quite a big part here, right, of the frog. So we are going to study the breathing mechanism involving the lungs, all right? And frogs breathe through the mouth and the lungs when in an active state on land, okay? Now, in water, they will use the skin for gaseous exchange. So gaseous exchange to the skin is very simple. It doesn't involve inhalation or exhalation, right? So it's just diffusion of oxygen into the skin and diffusion of carbon dioxide out of the skin. But we're going to concentrate on the exhalation and inhalation process involving the lungs. So let's discuss inhalation and exhalation in the frog. Now, the inhalation process is a two-step process. So in the first step, the frog will fill the bucopharyngeal cavity with air. All right. So this part is the bucopharyngeal cavity. It includes the mouth and the pharynx. And first of all, the mouth must close. All right. The nostrils must open. And then the glottis closes. So air can only enter from the atmosphere through the nostrils, which is like the nose openings, right? Now, so first of all, the floor of the bucopharyngeal cavity is lowered, right? When it's lowered, the volume of the cavity, the bucopharyngeal cavity volume, will increase. But the air pressure in the bucopharyngeal cavity decreases, according to Boyle's law, right? So when volume of cavity increases, air pressure decreases. Then there is low air pressure in the mouth. Now, the higher atmospheric pressure outside in the environment will then force the air into the bucopharyngeal cavity through the nostrils. So if you look at the frog shown here, it is lowering the floor of the bucopharyngeal cavity here. You can see that the floor is moving downwards. Next, in inhalation, step 2, the aim is to fill the lungs with air. So the air has already been drawn into the bucopharyngeal cavity from the atmosphere, right? So now the mouth closes and the nostrils will also close to prevent any air from escaping through the nostrils. Then the glottis will open, okay? So the glottis opens to allow air to be forced into the lungs. Now, how is air forced into the lungs? The floor of the bucopharyngeal cavity will be raised, all right, so that the volume of this cavity here decreases. Then the air pressure in the bucopharyngeal cavity increases, so the higher air pressure in the bucopharyngeal cavity will push the air into the lungs, and the lungs will then expand as shown here. Okay, so here you can see the frog. Now you can see a frog with its bucopharyngeal cavity floor here being pushed upwards. All right, that is to force the air into the lungs for gaseous exchange to occur. Next, in exhalation, the aim is to cause the air to be expelled, okay, from the lungs to the atmosphere. So the nostrils open. The mouth still remains closed, right? The nostrils open and the glottis opens too. Then the lungs contract. Okay, so the lungs can contract and the air is expelled from the lungs into the bucopharyngeal cavity and then out through the nostrils, because the higher air pressure in the lungs will force the air to be pushed out. So some air is expelled into the atmosphere through the open nostrils, and the rest will mix with the air in the bucopharyngeal cavity. right? So some of the air is expelled out. So here is the table showing you the inhalation process, step 1 and step 2, and then exhalation. All right. So as what we have discussed, so in inhalation, the floor of the bucopharyngeal cavity is lowered, right, to increase the volume of the cavity, but the air pressure decreases, so air moves into the bucopharyngeal cavity. BC stands for bucopharyngeal cavity. AP is for air, right? So next, in step 2 of inhalation, the floor of the bucopharyngeal cavity is raised or pushed back in, pushed upwards, is moved upwards, so that the volume of the cavity decreases, but the air pressure increases, so the air will be forced into the lungs, right? And then in exhalation, it is the lungs that will contract, all right? Lungs contract to decrease the volume of the lungs, and the air pressure in the lungs increases, so the air will be pushed out through the bucopharyngeal cavity and through the nostrils. So you can copy these notes in your notebook. Lastly, let's go on to the fish. For the fish, the respiratory aperture or opening is the mouth and the operculum. Now here you see a fish that's called the betta fighting fish. And what I wanted to show here is that this fish can flare, it can sort of extend or move its operculum here, especially when it wants to fight with another fish of the same species. It will move its operculum outwards, and then you can see the gills very clearly. All right. So the operculum is a gill cover, a flap that covers the gills, as seen here. This is operculum. All right. Here, and it covers the gills. So it's used in the mechanism of breathing. All right. And the mouth too. The mouth can open or close, right? So it's used in the mechanism of breathing. Structures that help in breathing are the operculum and the muscular floor of the buccal cavity. So the floor of the buccal cavity is this part here, just below the eye of the fish here. It can be lowered or it can be raised, right? And then the operculum, this opercular cavity here can be expanded, enlarged, or reduced in size. All right. So take note, the fish is different from other organisms because it has two apertures or openings. The one is the mouth. So water will enter through the mouth. And the other opening is the operculum opening here. So water will exit through the operculum opening, just next to the operculum itself, just below the operculum. All right. So breathing mechanism is assisted by movements of the floor of the buccal cavity here and the operculum. So the floor of the buccal cavity is this part here. Cannot be seen here. I mean, it's just this yellow part here, but you cannot see the action. So the floor of the buccal cavity can be lowered or raised. Now, what is the buccal cavity? Buccal means the mouth. It's the mouth cavity here. This is the buccal cavity. All right? Here, buccal cavity. Now, let's discuss the breathing mechanism of a fish. The breathing mechanism of a fish is aided by its mouth movement, in which the mouth can open and close, and the operculum, which also opens and closes. So if you look at the fish from the side, especially a big fish, if you see it in the aquarium, you'll notice that it's always opening and closing its mouth, and also it will open its operculum, which is the gill cover. It will open the opening here, and it will close it. All right, these two parts are always moving. So it is carrying out the breathing mechanism. So we need to know this term, ventilation. What is ventilation? It is the breathing process. That is the physical movement or circulation of water or even of air for land animals. So it's the physical movement of water from the environment outside to the respiratory surface, which are the gill filaments here, and vice versa. That means when water is pushed out also back into the environment from the fish to the environment. And ventilation causes gaseous exchange to occur, whereby oxygen diffuses into the gill filaments and carbon dioxide diffuses out, right? So ventilation takes place when the fish opens and closes its operculum while swimming. So first of all, water is pushed into the mouth and then through the gills. And that's when the ventilation occurs, whereby gaseous exchange occurs. Okay, so ventilation is important as it increases the flow of water over the respiratory surface for efficient gaseous exchange, right? So the fish is always carrying out ventilation as it is swimming in the water. Now here's a useful diagram that you rarely find, which will help us to understand the action of the floor of the buccal cavity. The action of the floor of the buccal cavity is just the mouth cavity, right? So in inhalation, first of all, the mouth opens, but the operculum opening behind here is closed. All right. So this will allow water to only enter through the mouth. All right. And later water will exit through the operculum opening. Now, for inhalation, how does water enter the mouth? So the floor of the buccal cavity must be lowered. So this is the floor or the base of the mouth, right? The buccal cavity is the mouth cavity. And when the floor or the base of the mouth is lowered, then the volume of the buccal cavity inside will increase, but the water pressure inside will decrease, right? So then the higher water pressure outside the fish will force the water or push the water into the mouth of the fish. The water will be drawn into the fish through the mouth. That's inhalation. For exhalation, the mouth will close and the operculum opening will open, right? So the floor of the buccal cavity will be raised upwards to decrease the volume of the buccal cavity. Then this will increase the water pressure in the buccal cavity. So the water will move through the gills, okay? And then when the operculum opening is opened, the water will exit the fish through the operculum opening. All right? So when the water moves through the gills, then the gaseous exchange between the gills and the water occurs before the water exits the fish. So here's an animation to show you the action of the floor of the buccal cavity here. All right? Now when the floor is lowered, as in this case, inhalation occurs through the mouth, where water will be drawn into the buccal cavity, like this. All right? On the other hand, when the floor of the buccal cavity is raised, like this, then water will be pushed out from the fish through the operculum opening here. Okay, so water enters through the mouth but exits through the operculum opening. Different respiratory apertures or openings are used. So if you look at the fish, you always see that it is raising or raising the mouth is a buccal cavity floor, like this. Water in, water out. Water in, water out. So here let's discuss the complete process of inhalation and exhalation after discussing the action of the floor of the buccal cavity, right, just now. So in inhalation, firstly, the mouth opens. The floor of the buccal cavity is lowered to increase the volume of the buccal cavity here. And then the operculum cavity, which is this cavity containing the gill filaments here, it is enlarged. So this will also increase the total volume inside the fish, right? But the operculum opening must be closed so that water can only enter through the mouth. Okay? So when the floor of the buccal cavity is lowered and the opercular cavity is enlarged, the volume of the cavity will increase, right? But the water pressure in the buccal cavity decreases because there's now more space for the water molecules, right? So when pressure in the buccal cavity decreases, the higher water pressure outside the fish will cause the water containing oxygen to enter the mouth from the outside, right? So this is inhalation. Now for exhalation, the opposite occurs. The mouth closes. The floor of the buccal cavity is raised instead. So this will decrease the volume of the buccal cavity, right? And then the water will be pushed through the gill filaments here on both sides of the fish. So gaseous exchange occurs between the blood and water. And then the opercular cavity also becomes smaller so that there's pressure inside. And the operculum opening is opened so that water can be pushed outside. Okay, because as the volume of the buccal cavity decreases, the pressure of the buccal cavity increases and becomes more than the pressure, water pressure outside. So the high water pressure inside the fish's mouth will cause the water inside to flow out through the operculum opening. Okay, so that is exhalation. Now here is the table that shows you the action of the mouth, the floor of buccal cavity, opercular cavity, and so forth in inhalation and exhalation. Is like what we have discussed, so you can copy these notes if you want as a summary of what you have discussed. All right, so this section is important for objective questions, and so far hasn't been asked in the structured or essay questions yet. Now in conclusion, let's summarize the comparison of the breathing mechanisms in humans and animals. As we have discussed, the similarities are as follows. Humans and animals such as insects, frogs, and fishes have special muscular structures to expand and contract the respiratory cavity. For humans, we have the diaphragm, for example, which is a muscular structure that can expand and contract the thoracic cavity, right? And say for frogs, we have the muscular structure, which is the floor of the Bucopharyngeal Cavity, to expand and contract the cavity inside the mouth. Okay, so the breathing mechanism involves changes in the volume and pressure in the respiratory cavity for each of these organisms. All right, so for example, for humans, the breathing mechanism involves changes in the volume and pressure of the thoracic cavity, right? For insects, for fishes, it involves changes in the respiratory cavity, which is the buccal cavity or the mouth cavity. Now, lastly, the differences. These differences have been discussed just now in the form of a table. All right, so here I just compiled it all together. So you can copy this down in your notes, and it will help you to understand and memorize the process more easily. Right, that's all for this lesson. Do share, like, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I hope that you have benefited from this lesson. Goodbye for now.